do you have a sprinkler bottle so I can dampen the cottons? Use this, she said, and she handed me a bottle that had once held ketchup, but now had water with an ice pick hole in the top. When the bottle was warm, she and the baby again disappeared down the hallway without another word. Well, I took the bottle and I dampened all of the cottons, including the sheets, and rolled them up and tucked them into one of the baskets and continued with the dry ironing. Well, little Mark got up and came over and stood watching me for a while. And then he said, "I want some orange juice." "Well, go tell your mother," I said. "But you're supposed to get it for me." "No, I'm not here to babysit. I'm only here to iron. Now go tell your mother." Well, obviously quite miffed, he turned away and did that little boy stomp down the hallway toward his mother. Well, in about 15 minutes, he returned, and he was now dressed in blue shorts and a red and white striped knit shirt. And he was dragging a cardboard box full of toys, which he dumped out on the living room floor. He picked out 4 or 5 little cars and trucks and started pushing them around, crashing them into each other, and then rolling on the floor and laughing out loud. His mother showed up a couple of times to shush him for fear he'd wake the baby, and once again, she totally ignored me. Well, at 12 o'clock, she came back into the kitchen to fix little Mark's lunch. She fed him and then sent him out into the backyard to play. As she passed by me with her tray, carrying her own lunch and a fresh baby bottle, she said, "Your lunch is on the counter," and went back down the hall again. Well, I turned off the iron and went into the kitchen. My lunch consisted of a slice of Velveeta cheese between 2 slices of Wonder Bread and a smidgen of mayonnaise and half a glass of chocolate milk. I stood at the counter and quickly devoured it so I could get back to the ironing because I wanted to get away from there before dark. Well, I went back to the ironing, and in about an hour, little Mark came in from outside, clearly bored, and he looked at me and he said, "I want some water." I said, "Go ask your mother." You see, I knew by now he was testing me. Well, he just turned away with a little pout and went back outside. About half an hour later, he was back again. He came and he stood and he just watched me for a while longer. And then he said, "Are you a nigger?" I was so startled by the question that I stopped the iron in midair and just stared at him. I wondered if he actually understood what he was asking. So after a pause, I simply said, "No," and I went right on with my ironing. He wouldn't let it go. "Well, my daddy said, Joyce is a nigger, so you must be a nigger too." Well, I looked at him and I said, "Well, your father is mistaken. He should have said, Mrs. Jackson is a Negro." "What's that?" "It's what you call people with brown skin, Negro. Now, can you say Negro?" "Negro. Good. Now you can tell your daddy how to say it." "And her name is Mrs. Jackson. And when she comes again, that's what you should call her, Mrs. Jackson." "Why?" "Because she's a grown-up. And just like I call your mother Mrs. Hemsley, you should call her Mrs. Jackson. Now, can you say Mrs. Jackson?" "Mrs. Jackson?" "Yes, Mrs. Jackson. Now, that's what you call her next time she comes. Now, go back out and play." Well, clearly chastened, he went back outside. Now, I knew I had to get out of that house as quickly as possible. So I hurried through the rest of the ironing and finished up at 3:30. I called down the hall to Mrs. Hemsley to let her know I was finished. She came into the room, she pressed some folded bills in my hand and said only, "In a couple of weeks, I'll let Joyce know when I need you back." Well, on my walk back to the bus stop, I made up my mind I would never enter that White House again. with its white attitudes, where hired help can be disrespected and little boys learn by example how to call people nigger. When my mother got home from work, she counted out the money and she asked, "Did you keep any?" "No." "Well, did you finish the job?" "I ironed every piece." "Why?" "Because this is not what she agreed to pay you over the phone. She shorted you $5. Well, now I was really angry. So I gave my mother a blow-by-blow description of how my day had gone, and then she got angry. "Well, you are never going back there again," she said, "and I will tell Joyce exactly why." I just smiled because I didn't tell my mother I had already made that decision. And then after a pause, she said, "Well, it seems you handled yourself well today, but you learned some important lessons. You learned how you might be treated out there in that white world, where even the children learn at an early age to disrespect you. Take what you have learned today and use it to protect yourself from the meanness and unfairness you might encounter out there." By now, my anger had faded some, so I said, "Yes, Mama." "Oh, and Mama, I learned something else too." "What's that?" she said. "Well, you see, Mama, I always thought that white people had better houses and better stuff than us, with lots of money, and they must be happy all the time. But Mama, that lady didn't seem happy. She couldn't even act respectful. She never said hello or goodbye or thank you. And Mama, that little boy didn't seem happy either. I almost felt sorry for him. And that house wasn't even as nice as ours, Mama. It was dreary. Our house is a happy house. We have to do our own cleaning and our own ironing, but we happy, Mama. Ours is a happy house. Oh, and Mama, there's another reason why our house is better." "Why is that?" she said. "'Cause Mama, you would never answer the door with pink rollers in your hair and barefoot." Mama laughed out loud as she said, "Amen to that." The bus bench. Now, my commute from Howard University home required a transfer from streetcar to bus. And the wait was usually 15 or 20 minutes. And I generally spent the time studying. Well, one day, as I sat there on the bus bench with a book open on my lap, studying, waiting for the bus, I noticed a little girl, about 3 years old, standing next to the knee of a young white woman who was reading a newspaper on an adjoining bench. She was a cute little girl. She must have been about maybe 3 years old, and she had on a purple jumpsuit with a matching purple ribbon tied around a top net of blonde curls. She was watching me, so I smiled at her, and she smiled back, and then she shyly hid her face against her mother's leg. Well, I went back to my book, but the next time I looked up, she was still watching me, so I smiled at her again. And once again, she smiled at me and then hid her face against her mother's leg. Well, we played this little smile and hide game for a while, but then she stopped hiding, and she took one step toward me. Well, I pretended to read, but I was watching her. And she took another step, until finally she was standing next to my knee. I looked up and smiled at her, and she reached out very tentatively with one finger. She touched my hand, and then she pulled back. As I continued to smile at her, she reached out again, and this time she laid her whole hand on the back of mine, which now rested on the closed book. Her little hand was as soft as a kitten's paw. Well, she did that a couple of times. And she was so pleased with her accomplishment that she let out a bubbly little girl giggle. Well, her mother looked up at the sound. She dropped her newspaper on the floor. She jumped up. She ran over. She snatched up her daughter to her chest, and she started to back away. I'm so sorry that she disturbed you. She doesn't know any better, the woman said kind of breathlessly. Oh, but she didn't disturb me. She wasn't bothering me. It's okay. It was just a game. She was playing a little game, just having fun. Really, it's okay. But the woman continued to back away. And then she quickly returned to her bench, and she sat down again with the little girl on her lap. She leaned down and she whispered something into her ear. The child looked distressed, almost frightened. I smiled at her, but she didn't smile back. So I went back to my book. Well, the little girl sat still on her mother's lap for about 5 minutes. But then, as children do, she got wiggly and wanted to get down. Her mother stood her down, but held onto her arm with one hand. I smiled at her, and she smiled back, and she took one step in my direction. The mother snatched her back, picked her up, and set her down roughly on the bench next to her. And she leaned down and she whispered something in her ear again. The little child started to whimper. At first, I just felt sorry that the little girl had had her fun disrupted. But then I got angry. Because you see, I knew that mother would not have acted nearly so forcefully if that little girl had wanted to touch the hand of a young white woman sitting on that bus bench. I couldn't help but know what lesson she had just taught that child. Just about that time, my bus arrived. And as I stood to board the bus, I smiled at the little girl one last time. She didn't smile back. She put her thumb in her mouth and laid her head against her mother's side. As the bus pulled away, my anger turned to sadness. For once again, I had been alerted as to my place in society. It was 1953. And the civil rights movement had swept across the South, but it had not yet reached Washington, D.C. I could only hope it would arrive in time to save that little girl, to save her from the adult attitudes that would leave her suspicious and apart from other people, to save her from the restrictions that would limit her friends to people who look like her, to save her from growing up to be the kind of mother who would snatch up her own little child to protect her from touching the hand of a friendly black woman sitting on a bus bench. Thank you very much. I can't believe what I'm seeing happening. I never thought there would ever be a serious female candidate. I never thought there would ever be a serious black candidate. And as somebody once said, the Lord must be laughing at us because we got two of them running against each other. This is a part of the history of this country that will be talked about long after we are gone. So folks, pay attention. I don't know what's going to happen, but history is still in the making. Thank you so very, very much for being here.